Thank you, and thank you for coming along. As Milan mentioned this morning, there's been a little bit confusion about the title of my presentation. And actually, it's quite a lot about enterprise architecture and checklist, but I'll also make some connections to design. But I guess that Milan thought that more of you would come along if it had this title and not saying too much about enterprise architecture. Well, I hope you will live with that. Otherwise, you'll have to leave right now before I go on. Well, I hope you'll be fine. As Dennis said, I'm from the Danish Ministry for Higher Education and Science. So that's my enterprise. What we do as a ministry, we do policy, of course, on regulations. But apart from that, we also do some services for the public, and as many other public institutions. And in our case, we are giving grants to students and scientists applying for grants. So our customer is a person wanting some money from us, and that's our product, we give them to them. I'm an enterprise architect in the ministry, but I'm also a project management office, and I'm very experienced in project management and in enterprise architecture, and just a little in design. But I'll get back to that. First of all, when I talk about designing the enterprise, I have this basic assumption that what actually forms the enterprise is projects. And if you could just imagine that you have an enterprise, perhaps your own enterprise, and what changes it over time is in quite to a quite large extent, it's the projects that you actually do in your enterprise. Of course, culture and people and all that are a big part of the enterprise as well. But when it comes to the structures and capabilities of the enterprise, it's basically made in projects. And when I say projects, it can be all kinds of projects. Yesterday, we heard a great story from Joseph O'Sullivan when they took 600 people, put them in buses, and made them go out and talk to people about some tax services. And that could be one process which actually would change the enterprise in a way. This 600 employees would get a better understanding of their customers and would begin to act differently. And in that way, you have changed your enterprise. Another project could be that you invest in a sales management system, which will give you 13 clicks for the salespeople instead of 3 clicks like in the old system, if you remember the story this morning by Jerry McGovern. So you are changing your enterprise all the time with the projects you are doing. Hopefully, you're going in the right direction, but it depends very much on the success of each project. And that is my basic assumption, that if I have to design my enterprise, I have to make sure that the projects are going in the right way, in the right direction. So I liked very much that picture from yesterday, that in some way you try to jump on a moving project and do your stuff. And that is my way of doing it in the ministry. We're not having like a big enterprise architecture division. It's not an enterprise architecture-driven ministry. It's a policy-driven ministry. The minister will tell us if we tell him something differently. I have to work project by project in order to give the direction to the enterprise as a whole. A bit about project management. We are very much in the business of making services to the public, very much in form of IT projects. And we have a project model which is very much widespread in government and in other institutions and companies. It's a stage model like this one. I don't know if you have seen stage models like this, but it's very common. It's a best practice model developed in Britain called Prince2, which is the basis of this one. And the whole idea of a stage model is that you take one step and you stop and you think very thoroughly, do I want to jump into the next stage? So when we want people to follow a model, it's in order with stages, it's in order to make them stop and think, are we still in the right track? Is this still a good idea? Should we continue or should we stop the project? And there's been done a lot of research and a lot of experiences has been collected on the best way to analyze, the best products to make in the different stages. And in the stage of specifications, there's been research on different ways of specifying solutions and so on. So when you take the dark blue stages, they are actually well described, and we are getting quite good at going through these stages. The light blue stages, the idea stage and the implementation stage, they're not that well described, but we are working on it. We realize that the implementation, for instance, if you buy a sales management system and then you present it to the users and hope that they will start using it in the right way. Sometimes they will, sometimes they won't. And it's a problem because you spend a lot of money on this system, and the value you should get out from it would be that people could work faster or better or something like that. So we are very concerned about this last stage, the implementation. And actually, the reason is of course obvious. You want the benefits from the projects in this stage. And also, you actually don't know if your idea was good until you have realized the benefits that was planned in the last stage. So it's the definition of innovation is that people creating value through the implementation of new ideas. So it's not necessarily innovative to have a lot of good ideas. It's not until you actually implement them and see whether you get your benefits that you know you have done some innovation. Okay, so that's what we're doing. We do a lot of projects and we are very good at it, but still we have some challenges. And this is from a report from EU saying, after at least a decade of large investments, and for me, investments and projects is the same thing, running into billions of euro at digitalizing the public sector, governments in Europe are still mostly unable to objectively quantify and show the benefits and returns of such investments. Now, as a taxpayer, it's not good. It's quite bad, actually, but it's a fact. And you may think, well, that's the public sector. There's always problems. But actually, we have the same situation in private sector as well. This is a quote: most large capital investments is from North America. Most large capital investment projects come in late and over budget, never living up to expectations. More than 70% of new manufacturing plants in North America, for example, close within their first decade of operation. That's not too good. Approximately 3/4 of mergers and acquisitions never pay off. Mergers and acquisitions is a very common way of designing your enterprise, affecting it at least. The acquiring firm's shareholders lose more than the acquired firm's shareholders gain. So it's apparently often a lose-lose game to go into mergers and acquisitions. And efforts to enter new markets fare no better. The vast majority end up being abandoned within a few years. So it's not looking that great. Perhaps some of you know Daniel Kahneman. If you're into behavioral design, especially he's a psychologist. 2 years ago he wrote a book which has more or less become a Bible in behavioral design. It's called Thinking Fast and Slow, about the way people think. He is a psychologist, he's not an economist, but actually he got the Nobel Prize in economics back in 2002. Because of his work with these questions, why does it go wrong when we invest? And what he showed through his research was that people in general, we are overly optimistic. So we get an idea, and because we get the idea, we think it's a good idea. And even if we put together, let's say we have a CEO, he puts together an appraisal team to look thoroughly into a new plan, they will also be overly optimistic. In some way, they will get blind to the risks they are facing with this project. So we're having a problem in general. And what I ended up thinking is maybe we are getting the wrong ideas. And the problem with the project model, as I told you, is that it hasn't got much theory on how to get the right ideas. And this is where I hope for designers to help us. I just listened to, what was his name? Rupert in the other room, talking about framing ideas. And it was a great exercise to really work with your ideas and make sure it's a good idea. So we're not good at that. And I know for sure we are good at making projects. We are trained, we have high competencies, but the problem is, I think, that we simply make the wrong projects. So that's, in a way, our project thinking. There's one thing, some of you have been working together with project managers, you know that when first they get in action, if they have got their project brief, they have to narrow their minds. They really have to focus on the scope of the project, and every disturbance to the project, you have to close it down as fast as possible. And one of the big risks for a project manager is actually to talk to the users. I have several times experienced that, well, what if we showed the users some mock-up on this system and had some feedback before we implement it? They would actually say, no, we better not show it to the users, because they might get expectations that we actually listen to them. It's okay to say in that way when you are in project management. And you know, of course, what I've seen in these 2 days, it's not the way you think about users. But anyway, that's our situation when first we are in project management. I'm not a designer, as I told you, but learning from these 2 days and some other conferences I've joined, I've learned so much that you have another project model called the squiggle. You want to learn from people. That's essential, crucial. I've seen it in almost all the presentations. You want to find patterns and then narrow your focus, design principles, make it tangible, most of all. You want to make some rapid experiments with customers, and you want to iterate relentlessly. And just the thought of iterating after you made your scope is what can really make a project manager mad, because he don't want his scope to creep in any way. So this whole idea of doing processes like this, taking a prototype to the customers, getting some new ideas, changing your scope, making prototyping, whatever, it's totally against the whole way a project manager works and against his criteria of success. So the problem is what to do. And I think I know what to do, and I'm really interested in your opinion on that. Because I know in project management we do have to be linear and narrow and all that. So my first idea is not to combine them, but actually to put them online. So what I would hope for is that as designers, you could help us finding the right ideas. So I put in better ideas as the first stage. And then when we have framed the problem, worked with prototypes, and so on, and we are quite certain about the concept, that's when you leave the project and we give it to the project manager, and he produces or manufactures the product. So we have to, well, at least when we are in my kind of projects in my world, I think that we could gain a lot from thinking in this way. So that was a bit about how I think project management in connection with design management. Now, enterprise architecture. You may have seen Ida C's nice framework, enterprise design framework. And if you look in the top, in the big idea, you will see one of the aspects is architecture. And when we talk about enterprise architecture, we actually have a whole framework for describing that. So in a way, it's a framework inside the framework. But as I will show you later on, I see it very much as two. They're both, I'll give you a bigger picture of it. They're both holistic frameworks trying to explain the whole enterprise, but from two different perspectives. The design perspective is more human-centered, while the enterprise architecture framework is more IT-centric, of course. But both still are trying to embrace each other and embrace the whole enterprise. So we have a lot of aspects which are identical. The design framework have more aspects on the human-centered aspects, and of course the design touch point and things like that. But actually we have room for them in the enterprise architecture framework as well. Just to give you an idea of a framework like this, you can see we have in the top row, we have like 5 headlines: strategy, processes, information, application, and technology. And that's the way we try to divide the different aspects. And the way I want you to see it, it's more like a bookshelf. In Denmark, we actually call this a bookshelf. It's the enterprise architecture bookshelf. Because you can, if you walk into a library, you know exactly where to find the crime stories, and in another section you will find biographies, and you can go to a place and find history, books on history and so on. And what we want to do with this framework is that we want to document different parts of the enterprise. We could document, for instance, a customer journey map. That's a sketch, and we would put it on the top row in the shelf where it's set processes, for instance. The user journey map as well. And if we take a process, a workflow, you see, I don't know if it has a, yeah. Here we put in the workflows. So if you make a process diagram showing what happens in a process, we put it in there. So we have shelves for all kinds of things. If we have like a strategy, and it doesn't have to be an IT strategy, it could be a brand strategy as well, or a financial strategy. We will put it in this bookshelf. And if you have a number of initiatives that you have already decided to work with, you will put them up there. Here, policies and principles. You may have, if I should have an example from design world again, you could have some brand policies. You would put them there. And you may have business rules, regulations. You may be in a business where there are strict rules about your products. It could be in the medical business or in the car business, whatever. You have rules about security and health and environmental issues and so on. So you have to work within some regulations in almost any business. When it comes to the processes, it's very much about how you do things, how your customers do things, and so on. And we would like you to draw it in a way that is standardized. So, for instance, we would ask you to use a special notation. When it comes to information, we also have different levels of information, whether it's conceptual on a high level or if it's operational on the low level. And in that way, we also describe our applications. The applications that you use in your enterprise, you need to know if you got one sales management system in one part of the enterprise and you are going, you need one in another part of the enterprise. It's nice to know that what is actually already bought, so you won't have to buy the same product twice. And it sounds ridiculous that people could do that, but they do that a lot. One of the very easy tasks for an enterprise architect is to get an overview over all the applications in the enterprise and start taking away every one that is redundant. When it comes to technology, now we are very IT-centric. I won't go into details, but we have to have an overview of the technology as well. Because when we use this framework, we want to be sure that we got some documentations, of course, but also that, oops, sorry, wrong button. There are relations between the bookshelves. For instance, if we do a business process, we may use some data in this process. So there's a relation between our data and the processes. And these data, they may be processed in an application, and the application is run on a server somewhere. Hopefully, every server runs some applications that are used processing your data in one of your processes that hopefully support your strategy. So there should be relations in all directions in this framework between all the shelves in this bookshelf. And that's what, when we talk about alignment, we talk about making sure that we are aware of the relations, that we don't miss something. Oops, we made a product that is not legal. That wouldn't be nice. Okay. Dennis just told me to move on. I'll move on. When we design our enterprise, we go from an as-is situation to a to-be situation. And you could do that in a very managed way if you have a big enterprise architecture division and a lot of resources. But that's not always the situation. The situation in my ministry and in some other enterprises, I guess, is that we have an as-is situation for sure. But some projects, they are decided by the CEO and gives you the right direction. There might be a manager in one of the business line who decides for another project which goes in the wrong direction. So we are having projects going in all kinds of directions, and you want to, in some way, to align them. And that's where we can use EA and, I believe, design techniques. And the moment of opportunity is where we get in touch with the projects. And very often we haven't got that much time. What I do in the ministry is that I kind of jump into the project with my framework in this stage, and I make it easy for the project. I make an enterprise architecture inspection in 3 hours. So I ask them to join me in 3 hours, and we go through 45 questions. We invite the right stakeholders, and the project manager will make a written report. So idea is that we have this moment of opportunity to have a dialogue with the project. And we bring in some experienced enterprise architects. We could bring in some experienced designers and ask a lot of good questions to the project. Have you remembered this? Have you framed your problem before you started? And so on. And that's actually what we do. And we ask them to make some documentation, but this checklist we're using, it's actually used all over government. It's based on the framework, as you can see from the colors. And this is in Danish, so you won't understand it, but I've translated some of the questions just to give you an idea of what kind of dialogue are we having. And one question is this one: are users involved from the start? That's a very simple question. And I'm sorry to say that it's not always that we can say yes. But we have this dialogue with the project management. Perhaps we'll ask them to go back and do some interviews, some workshops, or whatever. But it's the opportunity to ask this question, and we will have the chairman of the committee sitting there with us as a key stakeholder and go through these questions. Another questions: are the business principles and strategies supported? And so on. We have some quite open, simple questions, and the project manager has an opportunity to say that it's handled, or what does that mean? And then we have a good dialogue about it. In Denmark, we have a rule saying that when we make a new IT system, if there are public data in the database, we have to make it public, so people can actually take their data out, and so on. This is just examples of questions. We have some principles about it. Now, at this session, we simply sit with a spreadsheet and go through these questions. And the project manager will fill in the conclusions. Now, the way we made it, it's based on decision made in the parliament. It's based on advice from the National Audit Office. It's taken out from national digitization strategies and so on. So it's things that we actually have to do, and it's things that the project manager probably knows about, probably doesn't know anything about. So it's also a kind of a list to remember what to make sure before you finish your project. I've been to Greenland a couple of times, helping them making a digitization strategy, and they decided to make their own. And they took some questions from the Danish list, and they took some of their own strategic policies and so on, and they make their own checklist. And my point here is that you could make your own checklist in your own enterprise. And when you get the opportunity to jump into a project, you could go through this checklist with them. Now, what I'm hoping for when I go back to Denmark, I'll hope that I will be able to put in some extra questions. As I told you, we have 45 questions now. I could imagine question number 46. Is the project idea designed, for instance? I would love that we have a stage in the beginning of the project where we got some designers on board and made sure that we had a really good idea. My last point is that you need in some way to establish this dialogue with the project. And for that you need some kind of governance. And in project management we have a lot of governance. At every stage we have to do some specific things. And that's where I get my opportunity. All our projects, they know they have to talk to me. They have to go through these 45 questions in order to go to the next stage. So that's mandatory. Okay, so this is my 2 points. You can jump into a project and do your stuff if you have the right governance. And in my case, I use the enterprise architecture framework. You could use your design framework. For instance, when you walk through your squiggle, in some place you could check in on the different aspects. Did you remember this or did you remember that? So if you have any comments on this way of putting together, this way of seeing project management and design management in the way our enterprises evolve, you're very welcome on comments.
Thank you, Niels. We have time for 2 questions. Yeah.
Thank you, Michael Pulin. You mentioned that you would add additional question to your questionnaire about the design before the project starts. What design you're talking about, and how you, as an enterprise architecture, involved in the setting that this is the project, it will go forward. This is not a project, it will not go forward. So are you involved in that?
Well, that's more like, I mentioned I was project management office, and usually I wouldn't do, normally an enterprise architect wouldn't be in the stage management part of it. But being project management office as well, I'm very much in on the governance part and deciding how we make our stage management. So, and you have to have this governance, as I stressed at the end. Okay.
It strikes me the diagram you put up where you just put the design part back before what you get started with. The analogy that came to my mind, code, the legal infrastructure is also often called code. I mean, it bears a lot of resemblance to what the programmers have to do in some ways in terms of the structure and the exhaustiveness of it, and it has to run within a given legal framework. I'm wondering if there wouldn't be an analogy there that because we as designers think a lot about how to interface with the coders, the people that have to make it in machine language, and how that transfer goes. And it almost seems like when you're dealing with a legal framework that you've just got another layer of code in a way, and that we might relate as designers to that legal framework similarly.
Actually, we have a standard way of looking upon it as making business rules. That's a standard, actually, where you try to, if you have some legal regulations, you try to break it down into yes or no questions. And you call that business rule, and you can take it directly to the programmer. So there's a connection there, definitely.
Yeah, I think for me, you're closer to the coders in some ways than you are to the designers.
Yeah.
Because of all the rules and but anyway, it was just a thought.
Yeah. Yeah, okay.
We would have some minutes left for another question.
This morning, we saw the .co.uk as a really good example of a government website, and the US healthcare as a really bad example. Do you have any insight as to how either of those organizations do this, or what kind of systems? Do you know how the UK manages to get to a good place?
I have some insight on the UK situation. They established a team in Downing Street 10 to work intensively with behavior. And they have been working for a couple of years, And the ideas of what works and what doesn't work has been really put into projects in government situation in UK. And their website is a long and very popular story, because they took a lot of websites. You would have, I wouldn't mind saying, hundreds of websites, and you consolidate it into one. So you have, as a citizen, you would have one way in. That was the Gov.uk. And always focusing, as Jerry McGovern also told us, on the function all the time, what works and what doesn't work. And they have really refined their methods on finding out what works with the users. So that's very, it's not just getting an idea, hey, let's do it without pictures. It's a lot of hard work.
Any other questions? Then thank you, Niels.
Welcome.